Welcome to the Bridge Builder Program, an initiative of the Minnesota Catholic Conference where we help you live your faith in the public arena. I'm Jason Atkins, Executive Director of the Minnesota Catholic Conference, and joining me in studio is our producer and Minnesota Catholic Conference Communications Manager, Kit Sapiniak. Hey, Kit.
Hey, Jason. Hey, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. As you do every week, we're so glad that you could join us. Remember, if you ever miss an episode, you can find all of them at mncatholic.org/podcast. And you can also catch us on our YouTube channel. You always want to see those great faces behind the mic, right? Jason, who are you speaking with this week?
Well, I've got a face made for radio, but hopefully we've got someone a little bit more interesting. Father Carter Griffin, he is the author of Cross-Examined Catholic Responses to the World's Questions. He wrote this book because he is a formator of young priests at the St. John Paul II Seminary and wants to equip them and prepare them to give reasons for the hope that is within us, and do it so with gentleness and reverence, as it says in 1 Peter 3:15. So we'll talk with him about that and why he wrote this book and what relevance apologetics and being prepared and principled plays in fostering civic discourse and civil discourse in public life.
Sounds like it'll be really important for, very useful, I should say, for some of these upcoming maybe Christmas gatherings with family or friends, when we're undoubtedly going to get some of those tough questions, whether it's on the maybe more theological or the political, and being able to give that witness, being prepared, not feeling ill-equipped to actually be able to give a response and in a civil way. Sounds like a great topic. Remember, everyone, if you ever have an idea for a conversation, send me an email with your ideas. The email address is show@mncatholic.org. Or you can just leave us a comment on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. I will be back at the end of the program with this week's action item.
I'm now joined on the Bridge Builder by Father Carter Griffin. He is a priest of the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., a graduate of Princeton University, and a former line officer in the United States Navy. He obtained his doctorate in theology from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome. After serving at St. Peter's Parish on Capitol Hill, in 2011, he was assigned to the newly established St. John Paul II Seminary in Washington, D.C., where he now serves as rector. He is the author of Cross-Examined Catholic Responses to the World's Questions. And we've brought him on the program today to share a little bit more about that book and apologetics more generally, and tackling tough questions in the public square, of which we have more. Father Griffin, great to speak with you. Welcome to the Bridge Builder program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, first of all, I got to ask, trolling through the local Catholic bookstore, there's so many books of apologetics out there. What prompted you to write this one? What niche do you think it fills?
I didn't start out wanting to write a book. I started out wanting to form seminarians in this important area of apologetics. Apologetics certainly isn't the end all and be all, but it's an important part of formation. I think young men preparing for the priesthood need that. But what I really wanted was something that would help them not just know the church's teaching, but also know what people are saying against the church's teaching, because that's really what they're going to be encountering, in their parish assignments and later on in the priesthood. So I looked around for that book. I couldn't find it, at least for contemporary matters. I mean, obviously the idea of having the sort of the opposing arguments and then the counter arguments at the end is a very ancient one. I mean, it goes back to the times of the scholastics. But anyway, so I looked around for that kind of a book for contemporary issues, couldn't find one, started to do my own kind of for the seminarians. We do maybe 3 or 4 a semester. And over time, these built up, and a lot of people just said, I think others could find this helpful as well. So that's sort of the genesis of the book. There are outstanding apologetics resources out there. And in fact, I really believe we live in sort of a golden age of apologetics. Some of the great minds out there right now have been helping us to understand the rational basis for our faith. So I don't consider this book to be in the same league as them, but it does offer a certain kind of approach to it that I at least I find very helpful.
Well, I'm really intrigued that you connected this to seminarian formation, because they get these questions all the time, and your book deals with questions that haven't been on the horizon very long, gender dysphoria and the transgender question, for example, but also basic questions of the faith that we hear about, perhaps from Protestants or others. But I like to use alliteration. I'm thinking of the old line, preparation prevents poor performance. So we're preparing seminarians in apologetics, but it also brings to mind, 1 Peter 3:15, always be prepared to provide the reasons for the hope that is in you. And so this is not just a technical trade, the world of apologetics, but it's really something all Catholics should practice.
I think that's right. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. One of them, you just pointed out from St. Peter, to be able to make a defense. I mean, people need to know that what we believe is not just kind of pulled out of a hat. It's not a kind of an irrational sort of close your ears, close your eyes to any opposing arguments approach. I mean, ours is one that is vibrantly open to what is true. And our desire for what is true includes the use of our reason. So I think that's a very important reason. I think another really important reason for everyone studying apologetics is that it kind of bolsters our own faith in what we believe. I mean, it means that we've actually taken seriously those who disagree with us. We've also taken seriously, the arguments for and against different teachings. And I think that there is a beautiful integrity of the Catholic faith that comes out in a particular way when you study apologetics. You just see how everything kind of fits together in this wonderful whole. And the more you grow, in this area of the faith, I mean, suddenly sort of rising tide floats all boats. Suddenly you realize a little bit more about this other area of the faith, and that in itself is a kind of meta apologetics, where you kind of see the whole thing fitting together and in a rational whole. So I think those are some of the reasons why all Christians and all Catholics can really profit from studying some apologetics.
I think, doctrine and apologetics for a long time got a bad name as we look to more experiential perspectives on the faith. I used to call CCD cut, color, and draw. That's what I grew up with. But I think an important point you make in the book is that apologetics, far from being, rigid or dogmatic or creating more division, actually can be a bridge to better understanding, empathy, clear up more misconceptions, biases. Say more about that. I thought that was a really important point.
Yeah, I think that's one important, the biases, there are a lot of misunderstandings. I mean, I'm a convert, and I used to have a lot of these prejudices. So I'm particularly sensitive to this fact. People out there thinking that, Catholics, the standard stuff, that we worship Mary, and that we hate gay people. And I mean, whatever the thing is on sort of the left or the right or the Protestant or the rationalists, whatever, that there are a lot of misunderstandings out there. I have this quote, I just wrote it down here because I love it, from Fulton Sheen. He says, "There are not over 100 people in the United States who hate the Catholic Church. There are millions, however, who hate what they wrongly believe to be the Catholic Church." And I just think that nails it. And so the more informed we are about our faith and about how to respond to some of these misconceptions and prejudices, the better off we'll be able to respond to them. And I think sort of related to that is, I mean, you mentioned sort of the prejudices and kind of coming to a better understanding of them. I also think that some of the harsh and kind of shrill division that we are experiencing today is caused not because people are engaging each other and realizing that they disagree with each other, but because they're not engaging with each other at all, And so when we're able to kind of thoughtfully articulate the church's position, but also to respect somebody who disagrees with us and acknowledge the fact that we disagree, I believe that ends up in a more human and unified approach than this idea of just like everyone going off into their own echo chambers and talking about how much they hate the other side, And so I think this is a very, very respectful way to go about that, which I think in the end will be far more unifying, even though it actually means us coming together and disagreeing.
And that's a really important point, is that how we engage the public debate and how we engage the public arena matters these days almost as much as what we say, because sometimes the messenger is the medium, more so than the message. And apologetics, far from being periphery to conversations of public import, actually is really, really important, because it helps us be a better witness, and it gives more credibility to the messenger. And that's one of the big challenges we have in the public arena today, is that our messengers are tainted, and it makes getting the message across more difficult.
I think that's exactly right. But you also are indirectly making another point, which is that this can't be a kind of skill set in isolation of a larger life, an effort and a desire to live the moral teachings of the church, to take seriously the full gamut of Catholic teachings, and not just the ones that we find convenient. And if we're not doing that, then we're obviously not going to be that effective of an apologist, or at least not as effective as we could be. So this is, I think, an important part of that, because our use of the mind is something that the Catholic Church has always taken very seriously, and that the Church is never afraid of the truth. The Church is never afraid of asking questions, and I think those all need to be out there. but at the same time, having that personal witness of faith is beautiful, and the moral example that we give.
Yeah, and the church talks so much about evangelization, and I think the point that comes across clear in the book and from what you're saying is that we can't be effective evangelizers without being able to have substantively something to hand on. If we don't know the faith, we can't hand it on to others. You can't give what you don't have, to quote an old maxim. But of course, coupling that with a life that mirrors your speech as well is key. As Pope Paul VI said, that this age needs not just teachers, but witnesses. So the two go hand in hand.
Right. And then he goes on, he says, and if they are effective teachers, it's first because they're effective witnesses, So if you want to be an effective teacher, you have to first be an effective witness. I listen to a lot of vocation stories. These seminarians will talk about how God led them to the seminary, and probably over the years I've heard hundreds of them. And when I'm at this stage, what I'm listening for is not so much the teaching that they struggled with, or the girlfriend they had to break up with, or whatever. But what I'm listening for now is like the Christian who was kind of the decisive influence. And it's almost always it's a parent, it's a grandparent, it's a priest, it's a coach, it's a teacher, it's a friend, a peer. But somebody, it's almost always one. I mean, maybe sometimes two or three, but usually it's one person who is that decisive fulcrum on which his vocation story turned. And very often it includes not just kind of their personal witness, but also their capacity to explain the church's teaching in a pithy way, which enabled them to overcome some prejudice, which just broke down that small barrier, and then that started the snowball rolling. So I do think that both the witness and the teaching go hand in hand very often in the existential lives of real Catholics, real people, at least in my experience.
Someone who reflected the face of Christ, who is also who we call teacher, Rabboni.
Yep, that's right? Exactly. Yeah.
Indeed. Now, some of our longtime listeners might be going, well, what does apologetics have to do with being a bridge builder in the public arena? And we've touched on a little bit of that, but I think it's worth pointing out and reminding people again that political questions, even at what level we put the speed limit on the roads, are ultimately moral questions. How do we create a safe public safety and transport system, for example? Do you recommend that people debating political questions try to identify the relevant moral principle at work and debate on those grounds? In other words, often political questions really aren't about the particular policy, but they speak to something deeper. Do you think that's an effective tool in apologetics, is to try to identify what perhaps the deeper issue is?
I mean, I think it's an extremely effective way. It won't work all the time, either because the subject matter doesn't really lend itself as easily, or because the interlocutors maybe are not willing or able to engage at that kind of a conversation. But I think more often than not, and certainly more often than I think a lot of people think, such a conversation can be really fruitful. And I think a lot of people assume, this is another area where apologetics can be helpful. I think a lot of people assume that if you start talking about moral principles, and especially in kind of the public arena, in the public square, so to speak, that you automatically are either, crossing over between the church-state divide, or something like that, or it's going to be an irrational kind of conversation because you're going to be speaking from very different principles. And I think that at least in our culture, where most people have been formed to some extent in a kind of a larger Christian narrative, there are far more things in common that we have than we might expect. So, you have somebody who, even those who disagree with us vehemently on, on the question of marriage or something like that, same-sex marriage or something. A lot of the principles that they are using to advance that argument are actually deeply Christian principles, even though we believe they're misapplied and so on and so forth. But so if we can get underneath the topic sometimes, and obviously you're talking about things a lot less controversial than same-sex marriage, but sometimes these policies seem to have very little to do with religion or with ethics, but in fact, you start boiling them down, you get to some of these basic principles that I think we can talk about. And apologetics, sometimes apologetics has a lot to do with using, for example, scripture to understand more deeply the church's teaching on purgatory, But sometimes apologetics uses sort of revelation very little. I mean, the rational defense of the church's teaching on, divorce or contraception or physician-assisted suicide or whatever it might be. Oftentimes, these are very neuralgic and difficult issues, but a lot of what the church teaches is not simply drawn from scripture or from tradition, but it's actually drawn from the realm of reason. And that, we believe in principle, is accessible to everybody, regardless of what your religious beliefs are. So I think apologetics also helps open up that world of kind of apologetics, of ethics that does not rely exclusively upon the facts of revelation.
Yeah, we used to talk a lot about the preambula fide,
That's right. Yeah.
these sort of first things that could be known even outside of revelation, and the idea that belief in God is just simply more rational
Yeah.
than not believing in God's existence. So that's a key point. We also had on this program Tom Holland, the British author, who's the author of Dominion. And his point was that all the debates today on key moral questions are really intra-Christian, debates about what our terms mean and how they apply. So I think you're highlighting that too. In the book, Cross-Examined, you at the beginning have pulled this passage from the second Timothy, and it's about the point when, and there will be a time when people will no longer tolerate sound doctrine. And certainly it seems that we might be living in one of those times.
Right.
So if that's the case, and so many people just seem to see what they want to see, regardless of facts. I mean, facts like, gosh, what are what are those? I'm just seeing what I want to see. And you could apply that to any number of issues, and I won't mention any here, but boy, the facts are what we want them to be, and the reality is what we want it to be. In that environment, what's the point of apologetics?
Before we started this program, you were telling me about, the audiences and things like that. And we just were commenting on how often you hear about somebody's vocation story, a conversion story, beginning by, hearing a snippet of a conversation on a talk show, something like this. And there's something, how is it that begins kind of the small spark that then kind of ignites into flame what happens with their conversion? And I think the reason, and you said it, and before we started the show, you said, well, the truth has a power unto itself, or words to that effect, that there is something compelling about the truth itself. And I think by having the conversation, just having the conversation itself will often be an occasion of grace for somebody. And so I think that's at least one part of the answer, is just having some confidence that by investigating these things and by speaking honestly, and having the conversation with somebody of goodwill, that the truth will out. I also think that we might sometimes underestimate the desire and the capacity of people today to have these kind of conversations. I think because when you sort of flip on the TV or the equivalent on the internet, you just sort of see the news feed or whatever, because there is such a kind of cacophony out there, and it's seemingly a kind of an irrational sort of, again, shrill sound to everything. We assume that everyone likes that and is into that, is contributing to that. But my experience is that a lot of people are more than willing to have a kind of a deep conversation about things, even if at the end of the day we still disagree, a respectful conversation. And I think what we need to be able to do as Christians is not only provide opportunities for that, but also be able to engage in those. And I think apologetics can go a long way. And even if we don't finally come to an agreement about a certain issue, I think what we will have done is increased the kind of the rational, kind of quotient, of the atmosphere, and raise the temperature just a little bit in those conversations. So I think we need to be prepared to do that. And I think apologetics can be an important part of that.
I think you highlighted a really important point, that so many folks are stuck in the tyranny of the present. And what I mean by that is that this thinking that a person who we encounter, their views are fixed. Yeah. Or that the political landscape is fixed at this moment and it's not going to change. But if we just reflect on our own lives, think of how differently we perceive or look at particular issues or challenges or things, just very differently than we did 5, 10, 15, especially even 20 years ago. And it's a helpful reminder to not get stuck in this tyranny of the present, but have a hope, have real Christian hope about the capacity of others and their openness to truth. And I think that's what you're really unpacking for us here.
Yeah, and to kind of have a supernatural outlook as we do it. And what I mean by that is not only bring the confidence, and that this can be a moment of grace for them, but also not try to judge too harshly or too quickly the results. Right? Oftentimes, people maybe in the kind of the heat of a discussion don't maybe make a big change of mind or change of heart. But I mean, very often people later on will think back and they say, that actually was a pretty good point he made. Maybe I need to look into that a little bit more. And for us too, like oftentimes our pride gets in the way, and then later on we're like, gosh, that was a good point. I wonder how how that would fit into the church's understanding of the human person, or whatever it might be. So I think having some confidence that good can come out of it, even if apparently it doesn't seem to produce a lot of fruit.
The sower sows the seed and does not necessarily get to reap the harvest.
Yeah, that's right.
Are people really relativists? And what I mean by that is, that's sort of the pose that a lot of people want to have is, to be the, sort of debonair nihilists or relativists or something like that. But in my experience, at least in practice, is that people aren't relativists at all and embrace really substantive moral positions on a whole array of questions. And the real relativists out there are a few. And I think the implication of that is that we need to have substantive debates on serious issues and get at the truth of things.
Well, and especially because I think not only are they not relativists, but oftentimes they're kind of firmly held views, border on the intolerant, I think, despite kind of the veneer of tolerance, oftentimes, and we see that sometimes in the questions of religious liberty and things. So if we're not out there kind of engaging in those conversations, then I think the conversations they'll still happen. They'll just happen without us. And so I think really being confident that, I don't think that people are just sort of live and let live in general. I think people have views and they have opinions and they should, but if we're not contributing kind of what we can contribute to those conversations, then we shouldn't be surprised when kind of people come up with all kinds of crazy ideas. We're supposed to be injecting a kind of an element of reason and of confidence and of and also a kind of broadening out from the purely visible, empirical, material world, the life of the senses that everyone sort of seems to live by, and sort of hopefully giving a kind of a broader and more spiritual view. And a lot of people, I think, will instinctively respond to that, because I think a lot of folks are looking for that today.
There's so much toxicity on social media and over Thanksgiving dinner, and a lot of people have come to the conclusion that you really can't be a good interlocutor with someone who doesn't share your basic premises. But I think what you're saying, and it seems to me arguing, is that we have to take that on a case-by-case basis and that we've got to have a little bit more hope. How would you respond to that claim that you really can't engage people productively if they don't share your premises? But if that's the case, what do we do about those folks? How do we respond to them? How do we encounter them?
What I found helpful, I've given a number of talks on gender issues and kind of a way that I approach it. The way that I typically approach it is to talk about the so-called two worldviews. That's what I call it anyway. And so the two worldviews, and one of them being the more classical worldview, the more Aristotelian kind of realist worldview, and then the other one being this kind of more modern, fluid, everything, deconstructions, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, everything is up for grabs kind of worldview. And so the whole talk, and the last, maybe if let's say it's a 45-minute talk, maybe I don't get to gender until about minute 30, because the first 30 minutes, I'm just talking about how different these worldviews are, so that we know what we know those two different worldviews. And then at the end we can say, and now given the classical worldview, this obviously makes a lot of sense, what we teach and what we believe about gender. I have had people who are themselves transgendered in those audiences, and they find it very, very helpful. And they're very grateful for the talk. They say at the end, obviously they disagree, but and they don't even necessarily agree with how I describe the other worldview. They would maybe take exceptions to that. But just the idea of saying, like, we are approaching this from two different perspectives, and people of good faith can come to different conclusions based upon these two different worldviews, which doesn't mean that we sort of give up and say, well, I guess we're just living these two different universes. No. But what it means is that so often we're kind of arguing, letter E and F and G, but really we need to be talking about A, B, and C, and like looking at that worldview and say, let's talk about, because I think something you said a moment ago, which is that, there are not many relativists out there. I also think that once people start addressing the presuppositions of their worldview, there aren't a lot of actual sort of, fluid metaphysical people out there. I think most people actually do believe that things are real, that there's something out there that I can know, that together we can pursue the truth. All these things that are characteristics of the classical worldview, I think a lot of people still hold to that. And they just sort of subscribe to this other one kind of by default because it's never been questioned. So that seems to be a far more fruitful and frankly kind of less explosive, a way to approach the Thanksgiving dinner kind of conversation. Let's talk about some of our basic suppositions here, and that can be a very interesting and pretty calm conversation, I think.
Yeah. So instead of avoiding the conversation with someone who doesn't share your premises, go to the premises themselves.
Yeah.
Do things have a nature? Are they ordered towards certain ends, or is reality just plastic?
Exactly.
And if we start on that terrain, then we might have a productive conversation. That's an excellent point. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is promoting, I think, a really important campaign called Civilize It, based on Pope Francis's call for a better kind of politics. What is the connection between being prepared and principled and civility in conversation?
I think civility has to be more than just good manners.
Mhm.
And I think that's where I think a lot of people dismiss that kind of talk. They say, well, I mean, when we're talking about these neuralgic issues or these very difficult issues where people's lives are at stake, our understanding the whole human person or the family, how can I possibly be polite in that sort of moment, right? That's not and I don't think that that's really what the Holy Father or the bishops are getting at when they're talking about civility in that case. I mean, it's sort of a part of it, I suppose. There's no reason to be rude, but it's not primarily about that. What it primarily is do I myself respect this other person, despite the fact that we may disagree on almost everything, at least, on the table before us? Do I respect them deeply as a son or daughter of God, made in the image and likeness of God? And if I do, then I'm going to behave to that person differently. I just am. They may not reciprocate that, but they're far more likely to reciprocate that when I have respected them in that way. So I think what it's really getting at is sort of that basic level of deep respect that we as Catholics certainly believe that we should exercise towards all human beings, and then letting that overflow into our own words and our own thoughts. I'll give it a kind of an analogy. I was talking to the seminarians the other day about the idea of fraternal correction and how it's in the scriptures and how we're supposed to exercise that. And one of the points that I made, and I believe this very strongly, is that if they have something that they need to say to their brother, but they first bring it to prayer and they're kind of consult on it, and they have really sort of taken it seriously, they're going to speak that fraternal correction in a way that's it's just different, right? If I really do want to help you by saying this thing to you, and I'm doing this for your sake, not for mine, you can't help it, but the words are going to come out differently. And I think the same thing is true in our civil discourse, that if we actually have a real respect for that other person, then how we say what we need to say, even when it's difficult for them to hear, it's going to be different. And I think that's true civility.
And thinking about it, perhaps in terms of a work of mercy, I mean, instructing, the terminology is instructing the ignorant, which sounds a little presumptuous, but that's really what we're getting at, is that this is an act of mercy and charity, precisely because we will the authentic good of the other.
Yeah, that's right. And I think we can easily forget that because we're sort of concerned about it being presumptuous or, so I just think acknowledging the fact that we've been given the great blessing of being Catholics and having access to an understanding of the truth, which I think is a lot perhaps deeper than many people have had access to, and kind of acknowledging that we have a great responsibility to try to share that as best we can to the best of our ability.
So I've read your book, Father Griffin. I'm excited. I'm ready to do apologetics, but how do I know I'm fully prepared? What advice do you give people who they got the gumption to take on maybe be a little bit more proactive in their defense of the faith, but how do they know they're quite ready? They've graduated from apologetics boot camp and they're ready to go. What advice would you give to people starting out or bringing some zeal to their apostolic activity?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things. The first one is we have to go into this with humility. You mentioned the quote from 1 Peter 3:15, and the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and reverence, is what St. Peter says at the end of that famous quote. And so learning, I think, just knowing that if we approach these different difficult topics with a sense of gentleness and reverence, and also with a sense of humility, knowing that we're not going to have all the answers. If we go in there and just kind of sort of shoot down anything that looks suspicious, it's not going to go well. So I think having the humility to say, I don't know, in a conversation will itself give you the confidence to enter into a conversation. And to go to somebody and have an intellectually honest conversation where you get to the point, you're like, yeah, that's a great point. I've never heard that argument against the church's teaching on purgatory. Let me look into it. Let's continue this great conversation later on. And as long as you can do that, I think that will help. Also, I find that our own interest is one of the best spurs for our own intellectual development. So if you're interested in why the church teaches about, something about, whatever the confession, why do we have to go to a man for confession or a priest? Well, then look into it, and look into that particular topic and answer that question in your own mindset to your own satisfaction. And I think that'll be the best, because then you will have really assimilated and integrated this. If you're just kind of spouting out words that you've learned from a book like Cross-Examined or some other book, that's not really going to necessarily be the best thing for them. It has to become part of who we are so that we're saying it in our own words with our own experience. So I think all of those are different ways. There's certainly you never get to the end. You're always learning new things. And you kind of go into this with this exciting kind of approach of like, I'd like to learn more about the truth. And I'd love to share that with my friends, and my family members, my loved ones. And I think that's a great attitude with which to approach apologetics.
Father Griffin, I got one more question for you. You've done a great job of unpacking some difficult moral questions and cross-examined. But what do you see for volume 2? What moral questions do you think you might need to address when volume 2 of Cross-Examine comes out? What's on the horizon? Is it CRISPR technology, human genomes?
I know.
Vaccine passports? What's coming on the horizon on difficult moral questions?
I think we're going to have. I was just having a conversation with some priest friends of mine about the metaverse. That's coming up, and if they're able to pull that off, and everyone really does have kind of their real life, sort of in that digital world, and this is the kind of the life out here is what we use just to kind of, feed that and support that. I think that opens up all kinds of very important and interesting questions about morality in the metaverse. And all you do, does somebody go to confession for what they do? Could you have confessions in the metaverse? I mean, I think no to that, but just what does life look like? And when so much has been artificially kind of expanded for us, with AR or VR. I mean, in some ways, I think that's going to be a greater revolution than the internet itself in our lives. And so I think trying to work through that. And then, you just mentioned a couple of the other things that, that are coming up, but it's not just the technological things either. I mean, I think just deeper questions arise about different church teachings, dogmatic teachings. I mean, I think maybe getting into something about the different, about the human nature of Christ. And I think there are a lot of implicit Arians out there who sort of think that Jesus was a really good man, but sort of, a man, and not God, that sort of thing too. So trying to keep, there are 3 sections to this. It's kind of like the church and morality and kind of God and eternity, so like looking at these different areas and trying not to, because there's a tendency to sort of fall all into the moral issues, because that's what we first think of when we think about the controversial issues. So trying to keep a kind of a broader base, but I'm not looking at a volume 2 right now. I'm just trying to trying to do my job as rector of a seminary, but I did have fun writing this one. And so who knows, there are topics that come up and maybe there'll be a volume 2 someday.
Well, I've been encouraged by this conversation and wholehearted encouragement to think about volume 2. The book is Cross-Examine. The author is Father Carter Griffin, rector of the John Paul II Seminary in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for coming on the Bridge Builder program today.
Great joy to be with you. Thank you.
And we'll be back in a moment with this week's practical action item. Welcome back to the Bridge Builder program, where we help you live your faith in the public arena. I'm Jason Adkins, and now it's time to jump into this week's practical action item. Kit, what do you have for us this week?
Yeah, so as Father Griffin was talking about, responding to people's common objections on a number of issues, this week's action item really ties in with that, kind of continuing those civil conversations, civil discussions. This week, we want all of our listeners to take the Civilize It Pledge. It's a pledge through the USCCB. In taking that pledge, you're going to commit to speaking and acting with charity, clarity, and then to finding creative solutions with those who might disagree with you. It's really a great thing, a practical item that you can do ahead of some of those Christmas get-togethers with friends and family. Maybe you've already taken the pledge, so it might be just a good opportunity to sort of renew that commitment and further prepare yourself for having civilized conversations. So you can find further resources or take the pledge for the first time by going to civilizeit.org. Jason, whether someone is Catholic or not, we can always agree that our political discourse has become toxic. So why particularly is it important for Catholics to lead the way in changing this toxic environment that we have?
Well, because our responsibility is not to win arguments, but to win souls for Christ. And so oftentimes the messenger and how the messenger behaves and the witness the messenger gives is almost as important as the message. And so it's not just what we say, but how we say it. We can disagree without being disagreeable, and we have to model a better kind of politics, which is what Pope Francis calls us to in Fratelli Tutti. and what the Civilize It campaign from the USCCB is all about. Fostering a better type of politics and modeling a better way such that it pricks the consciences of those who are contributing to the toxicity and maybe encourage them and inspires them to do this better. Ultimately, politics is that conversation about how we order our lives together. We need to foster participation, but we also need to model civility, keeping in mind that other people are not opponents to be smashed into the earth, but they're our friends. And it's our job to persuade them and to engage them in a constructive way.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jason. And thank you, everyone who's tuned in again this week. If you're listening on the radio, remember you can also catch us on your favorite podcast app and on our YouTube channel for all of our extended conversations. Not everything always fits into 30 minutes. When you're there, make sure to click subscribe, and then you will always be notified of our latest episodes. Leave us a comment or send us a question. The email is show@mncatholic.org. And find any of our past episodes at mncatholic.org/podcast.
Thanks so much for tuning in today to The Bridge Builder. We'll be back again next week with another great guest and a practical way for you to build bridges between faith and public life. I'm Jason Adkins, and for Kit Sapiniak of the Minnesota Catholic Conference, God bless your day and have a wonderful holiday season.